Well, it's great to be here. Thank you first and foremost for having me and inviting me. And so, again, without further ado, I think I'm going to share my screen here and get started. And you should now be able to see the slides to get started. So it's a pleasure to be here. I think we have about an hour, and I think you'd like me to. How long would you like me to leave for Q&A? What is your norm? About 15 minutes?
15, 20 minutes would be fine.
15, okay, great. So, and what I would say is if people have questions as I'm going that require just a clarification, it's going to be hard for you to continue to concentrate. If we don't get it clarified, then please go ahead and interrupt. And I think Volker will kind of moderate that for us. So this is research that started in 2020 jointly with Sloan Management Review and Deloitte Consulting. It was about 2020, in March 2020, I think, somewhere in those first weeks, I received an email from David Kieran, now my co-author and editor at Sloan Management Review, saying, so I don't, if any of you are on the Sloan Management Review list, you probably get emails from David asking you to complete a survey or telling you about new information that has come out, new reports. And so this note from him said, this is not spam, or this is not a form letter. I know who you are, and I know Mike Tushman, who is my advisor. So that was like the key code word. And I'd like to talk to you about being guest editor for Sloan Management Review. And so from that, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about it, we embarked on this research. So let me go get started here. The agenda for today for this talk is as follows. On one hand, I definitely want to talk about the book. On the other hand, the book derives from this research that's been a multi-year project, and I think it's easiest to explain it and for people to understand it by kind of walking through the research and what we've learned over the past few years. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to tell you about our 2021 report, our 2022 report, an infographic that we just came out. I'll show you where you can access all of this because it's all publicly and relatively easily, I believe, available on the web. And then a little bit about what's next and the Q&A. So to get started right here, and we can put it in the chat or I can send it later. This is our landing page at Sloan Management Review. And if you can't easily find it, if you go under our research, if you go to Sloan Management Review under our research, there's a link that says Future of the Workforce. And if you go to this page, it will show you all of our reports in one place. And basically what it says is we've gotten together and decided that it made sense to think about where is the workforce going from here. And just a little bit of background again, when David got in touch with me, I had done some reading of work they had done before. And I said, it seems like most of your work is a little bit HR centric and is mostly focused on what happens inside an organization. And for me, though I was in a big organization and I actually taught HR at West Point, I tend to focus on what happens outside of organizations or interactions between organizations, right? So I do platforms and ecosystems. So I'm not sure this is a good match. Maybe I shouldn't work with you. And he said, no. And I think this was very insightful of the team. There's a reason we contacted you, and that is we think that this topic needs to be studied through the lens of platforms and ecosystems and spanning organizational boundaries and moving outside. And I said, well, if that's the case, and if you're willing to think about it that way with me, and where we can do this a bit as an experiment, then sure, let's try and let's see what we come up with. And from that, we came up with this notion of workforce ecosystems and the idea that the workforce spans beyond an organization's boundaries. I see that there's some amount of chatter in the chat. I will just tell you, I am not monitoring it. So let me know if there's anything that I should stop or clarify. Okay, so when we started this project, I'm a qualitative researcher, so we started talking to people, and luckily, fortunately, because of the institutions with which I'm working and some previous connections, we had access to amazing people who had incredible insights. So the head of HR for all of Walmart, people at Novartis and Unilever, in the military, universities, also entrepreneurs. And realized very quickly when we first started talking to them that it wasn't clear that we all had the same definition of a workforce. And so since my title was guest editor, Future of the Workforce, I said, I think we need to step back and decide what we mean by workforce. So I started asking the first question of an interview as, when we say workforce, what do we mean? Or when I say workforce, what do you think of? And to a person, big company, small company, internationally, nonprofit, for-profit, people would say, oh, that is a very good question. And if you've read any of our work, you see that we start some of the papers like this because it was so striking, the extent to which people said, this is a little complicated. And I thought, that's interesting. I wouldn't have thought this basic question is that complicated. And so what we found is that people have said, it's of course employees, right? So if you're in the United States, we call them W-2 employees because it's the tax form that you use for them. Outside of the US, called various other things, but it's basically people who have been employed by the organization, right? Either full or part-time, doesn't have to be full-time, but it's employed by the organization. Then they're contractors. And people will say, well, we've had contractors forever. I mean, I worked at Motorola a long time ago and we had contractors, lots of them. But we are now hearing that upwards of 30 to 50% of organizations can be contractors or contingent workers of some sort. That scale is relatively new. And the types of contractors is now incredibly varied. And why organizations use them is varied. And we have long-term contractors, freelancers, gig workers, so people coming in from all different ways. And of course, we have platforms like TopTal that I depict here that make it much easier for organizations to access individuals. And by the way, sometimes they work still with staffing agencies of various types. And so when Novartis has like 50,000 contingent workers, they're not hiring them one by one. They're going out and saying, we need 1,000 people like this, or 10,000 people like this. And so, and those people, by the way, may already be employees of another organization, either where this is a side gig, or they may work for a company that then subcontracts them out to another company. All of this to say, that's complicated and interesting for us. Amazon, when they decided to start doing their own delivery, at least in the United States, and also in some countries internationally, did not just hire drivers. They started to work dramatically with subcontractors. And so this was an article showing that often the people who show up at your door, who are wearing Amazon uniform and driving an Amazon van, may not be, or often driving not an Amazon van, some other type of vehicle, don't work for Amazon, right? They're entrepreneurs. They could be a mom and pop kind of an operation. They could be an individual, or they could be a pretty big delivery company that's subcontracting with Amazon. So again, you have individuals, but you also have companies. So that's why, again, for the book title, we talk about people, partners, and technologies, because sometimes these relationships are with individuals, sometimes they're with companies. So those contractors, subcontractors are often considered part of an extended workforce. That's not very new, but we've expanded it beyond that. And we've said, look, for example, smartphones. If I'm in a small class, sometimes I'll say, okay, how many, or even a large room, how many people in the room have a smartphone where the only software on it is made by the same company that makes the operating system? Please raise your hand, right? And inevitably, nobody raises their hand, right? How many people have a smartphone that have an app on it of some sort, right? That's made by some other company, but you benefit by it. And of course, these days, everybody. So those companies are not suppliers to the smartphone companies. If you're a strategist, you know them as complementers, right? They're app developers, they're accessory providers. And we would say, look, they are individually working to create value that benefits the primary company, in this case, the smartphone company. And together you deliver that value to a customer. The customer essentially bundles it themselves, but the product gets better because of it. So then are they part of the workforce or not, right? The people who make the Spotify app or the Hulu app or the HBO Max app or the games, those people who are making those apps that make the Samsung phone or the Apple phone better, are they part of Apple or Samsung's workforce? And we would say traditionally, no, they're not employed by them. But we would say, yes, they are part of their workforce ecosystem because they are creating value. Same thing with Amazon and sellers on their marketplace, right? The numbers are extraordinary, and the profits from marketplace sellers for Amazon. They are not employed by Amazon. Most people in a room, depending on where I am, if I say, have you ever purchased anything from Amazon or any of the other large platforms that was not purchased by Amazon, but is in fact Amazon working as a marketplace? These days, most people have done that through at least some platform or another. And those people, we would say, and those organizations can be considered part of the workforce ecosystem because those profits wouldn't accrue to Amazon without them. And then finally, it's now become quite common if I say, okay, how many people have ever fought with a software bot? They've wanted to get to a human or a representative. You've called some company somewhere and you just can't get through the chat bot. Those are also, we would say, acting as part of a workforce and thus part of a workforce ecosystem. And one of my favorite stories about this is we were interviewing a gentleman at NASA who is a pretty senior person at NASA about this topic. And he said, you know, we give our bots, our software bots, employee ID numbers. And I said, wait, what do you mean you give them employee ID numbers? And he said, well, of course, we don't give them badges, but they have to access data in our systems. And the way our systems are set up, you can't access the systems without an employee ID number. Now, clearly, this could be changed and maybe they can have access another way, but just the idea that even he mentioned it and that they're thinking about it in these terms says, are these chatbots then part of the workforce? And you'd say, well, no, you don't do performance management with them. And then you say, well, actually, you do, because we have metrics on them, and you think about how well they're doing, and some versions do better than other versions. So that's kind of performance management. And then you say, well, we don't pay them, we don't deal with compensation. And you say, well, actually, we kind of do, because we have to decide where we're going to invest and which ones we're going to use more or less. So there's a resource allocation discussion related to them. So all of that to say, chatbots, robots, AI of various sorts now, especially generative AI, is doing work for, all of these are doing work for the organization. So then the question is, are they part of the workforce? And again, we would say yes. And so January 2021, we came out with our first article, which is a very short research brief in Sloan Management Review that says, we think the future of work is through workforce ecosystems, that this governance structure, that this construct is a better, more holistic, more integrated way to think about a workforce. And so that's this article. And again, then that led to, in 2021, so January, we came out with the article. In April, we came out with a research report, which is a much longer report, and you can see it, download it online, and we include all of our data. We did a global survey that I'll talk about. And just while I'm here, I'll show you in May 2021, we built an interactive with our colleagues at Deloitte where you can mess around with our data and you can change filters and you can change things. So if you're interested in kind of getting a sense, we didn't do it with the 2022 data, but it's fun. And I guess if anyone would like us to do it with the later data, I'd be interested in knowing that, because it takes a little time and we're not sure if people love it that much, but we've had fun with it. So you can play with that. So in any case, we have put forth a definition. We have slightly different versions, but this is the main one, which basically says workforce ecosystems are a structure focused on value creation for an organization that consists of complementarities and interdependencies and the structure encompasses actors from within the organization and beyond, working to pursue both individual and collective goals. And let me just unpack that for a moment. So I'll pause also for a moment and say, because I think some on the call are academics, I'm not sure if we have practitioners on as well or who'll be listening to this, we've been straddling this interesting line where we want this material and this research to be very accessible, appropriate, practical for managers to use, but we also want it to have an element of rigor and an academic rigor. So we kind of combine the two, and I'm happy to talk afterwards also with any academics about being able to kind of live in this world that's a little bit of both. And so this definition, we hope, speaks to both in that we say it's a structure because it's a governance structure. So it's a way to look at an overall organizational system. It's focused on value creation, of course, for a central organization. So by the way, ecosystems sometimes don't have a central organization. These generally do. That's what we're defining it as. And complementarities and interdependencies. By complementarities, we mean that, and it's in kind of the fine print there, some members of the system work independently yet together. So this is, again, the app developers, and they offer value for mutual customers. So again, they're not suppliers, but together they offer that value. And interdependencies basically means parts of the system rely upon each other, and they either succeed or fail together. And so if you read Bron Adner's work or Rahul Kapoor's work or some other well-known scholars within the ecosystem world, this notion of complementarities and interdependencies are critical. These notions are critical for defining an ecosystem. And it's what makes this different than just, say, a group of alliances or a group of other types of organizational relationships. And again, the key here is actors inside the organization and outside, and individual and collective goals. And this is important because there have been times when I've been interviewing companies and they keep talking about their customers, and they keep talking about their which is great, and they keep talking about their customers as their end users, and they sometimes forget that they need to make sure that the other players in the workforce ecosystem are able to meet their goals as well. And if they can't, then they will not stay in your ecosystem. They'll go to somebody else's ecosystem. So that's the definition. And I think I'll speed up here a little bit. So we have quotes we ended up speaking to lots of people. I'll give you some numbers over the years, but here's Michael Smith, CEO of Randstad Sourceright, and he says, our customers don't perceive contingent workforce to be hired help. They perceive them to be a reflection of our brand. So the main message here is that customers don't care if someone's a contractor or an employee or a chatbot, frankly. They think they're talking to your organization, to your brand, right? And so that's very important because it means anyone who's interacting with customers reflects the brand. So the 2021 research, we had 5,000 survey respondents. I did 27 interviews with various of my colleagues, again, academics, CEOs, other types of subject matter specialists. The research spanned 138 countries, so this is not US-centric, 28% from the US, but therefore more than 2/3 from outside the US. 29 industries, which to me is fabulous because sometimes people say, oh, this is a tech thing, and I'm telling you it is not a tech thing. It is across industries. And 26% of the respondents' organizations had revenue over $1 billion. That's interesting to me also because it's not all big companies, but on the other hand, 26% were big companies. So that was our first year and what led us to this original notion. And then we identified drivers of workforce change. I'll hit them very quickly. Again, you can look at the report if you're interested in more. Basically, we say, look, the nature of work is changing. People are starting to do much more technology-centric work, much more project-based work, much more interdisciplinary work. Workers' preferences are shifting. So we started this research in early 2020. Of course, we didn't know what was ahead of us at the time. Interesting to me is we saw the trends moving in this direction. Clearly, the global pandemic accelerated these trends. We think they will continue long after we're through kind of the more critical period. But no doubt, workers' preferences were shifting before. They shifted during the pandemic. They're shifting even now. And we think they're shifting in ways that are much more aligned with an ecosystem approach. Technology is transforming how we engage and manage the workforce. AI has been all over the news, as we all know, but there are also other types of systems. The fact that we can have this on WebEx so seamlessly, that we can have Zoom calls, the fact that we can have credentials and verification of credentials, certificates, et cetera, is a very interesting conversation as well. So we have a framework with 5 different types of technologies that I may have time to talk about, but clearly that's part of this discussion. And one of the things we found interesting is that many workers, even if they're employees of companies, consider themselves free agents versus loyal employees. There are just many more options for people, and people know there are more options. And so the organizations and leaders need to think about the fact that even for your employees, they are thinking of themselves in this more flexible, fluid way, and that changes some of the approaches to leadership. So some of the survey results, again, these are the 2021 results, and we've seen them quite consistent. More than 8 out of 10 respondents consider external contributors to be part of their workforce. So there's, if you ask people, they don't say, no, we have only employees. And that actually went up in 2022. I think it's 93 or 94%. We'll get to it. Marcus Graf is a real forward-thinking person at Novartis, and he's the vice president of HR and global head of talent. And he says, we'll manage the workforce, external workforce, even more actively, not only to attract labor, but also to access skills. And if you're kind of in the space at all, you hear lots of talk about skills and need for skills. And so he mentions it's becoming even more important in tech-related work here, where skilled talent is less inclined to join a traditional workforce. And we see that across the board. We asked across categories which ones are expected to grow over 18 to 24 months. And again, this was now a little while ago. But what's interesting to me here is that all of the categories were expected to grow, and technology was expected to grow the most. And I thought this was interesting because we kind of threw the question in, and we weren't sure we'd get anything, but the idea that developers and or accessory providers, so these complementers, growing 38%, shows that organizations are really thinking about, and again, across industries, not just in tech, thinking about developers and accessory providers being part of the ecosystem. And of course, contractors, employees, and the last one is service providers, which is more traditional PR agency management consultants. And so, particularly in 2021, we were thinking about this move from a traditional employee life cycle to a workforce ecosystem approach, and areas that change, these are mostly usually associated with HR, but they're an example of very specific practical areas that for every one of these, I can give you examples of how it changes in a workforce ecosystem world, right? And we're kind of digging into each of these. As I said, so as was mentioned earlier, I've spent some time at West Point and with my colleagues in the US Army. And so I had the opportunity to meet with Major General Ronald Clark as we were talking about this. And I love this quote where he says, you have to think about it holistically, and you have to really harness the power that it's your entire workforce to be successful. He says, I've got to make sure we're building an entire team and that it's inclusive. And then he goes on to say, it's about pulling everybody in. We can't have people who are not inside the family being treated differently. They're here. Somebody brought them to the family reunion. Right? And so I think, again, this notion of having people who are part of your team from various different organizations. So when we talk also to a different general mentioned having green suits and blue suits. And the green suits are Army soldiers wearing camo green types of uniforms, and blue suits were people from the US Department of Defense, contractors and full-time. And basically, and I had a conversation with, yesterday I was giving a presentation, and there was a retired general who's now CHRO on the line. And she said, these days, the military across the world doesn't do anything that isn't integrated across agencies with civilians, with different services, different branches, different countries. So that's interesting to me because it means we can learn from those ecosystems. This is Kathy Benko. She's a board member at Nike and has some other roles, but she said here, a business unit leader's job is to get the work done. It's not their job to figure out how they develop all the skills needed for all the players. Nobody owns that. The project guy doesn't own it. HR doesn't own it. Accounts payable doesn't own it. Who owns it? And somebody else from a different company mentioned the notion that this is very much a hot potato question. And this question of, is it a procurement question? Is it an HR question? Is it an IT question? It's a CEO question, clearly, in a C-suite. But where does the jurisdiction lie for the entire workforce is really a hot issue right now. Because if you talk to HR professionals, traditional ones, not the more forward-thinking ones, they're responsible for employees, right? And they know that there are these other contributors, of course, but they don't fall within their domain and they don't have the tools to manage them. And so and when it was 5% of the organization, it wasn't a problem. But when it's 50% of the organization, it becomes a really interesting question of how this gets managed. And as a side note, so this is a 2022 report. We just recently, and I don't even have the graphics in here, just maybe last week, put out a new short article about managing contingent workers based on interviews we did with colleagues at Cisco, the networking company. And in there, we have some insights about managing contingent workers, especially when they're a large part of your organization. Okay, so 2022, we move into the next year of this, and we're realizing this is very much a phenomenon we're seeing. And so we published this report called Orchestrating Workforce Ecosystems. I actually have, believe it or not, hard copy right here. I can show you. It does exist in hard copy. There are few rare collector's items. If you really want one, we could probably get you one. But the PDF is available. The 2022 research is similar to the 2021 research, slightly different numbers, but mostly to show you that we kind of continued with this stream. So we had 4,000 managers, 129 countries, 29 unique industries, 19 thought leaders. Right. And again, you see here, we have 93% managers view some external workers as part of their organization's workforce. And you're going to see some numbers going down, and I think this is an interesting kind of story from the data. So 93% say, yes, external workers are part of our workforce. 74% agree effective management is critical to their organization's success. So we can't do well. 3/4 say we can't do well without figuring out how to do this. 58% agree that their organizations are currently taking an integrated approach. So a little over half are saying, yes, we're currently doing it. And then only 30% say, and we're sufficiently preparing to manage a workforce that will rely more on external contractors. So you've got 93% say they're important, and only 30% say we're worried about it, or actually we're doing something about it. That gap is where this research comes into play and why it's being well received, because managers are saying, leaders are saying, we know it's important. We're not quite sure what to do about it. We built a maturity index. I don't have time to go into too much detail on it here, but again, it's in the report, and I'd like to just give you a sense of some of the material that we've been doing. We built a maturity index, and we categorized respondents into intentional orchestrators and non-orchestrators, basically, and then partial orchestrators, because we realized that most of the companies we talk to have workforce ecosystems, pretty much everyone. But there's a difference between those who recognize that they have one and are thinking about managing it, and those that have one but really are kind of ignoring the fact that they have one. And so what we find is that intentional orchestrators And we've looked at it now, cut the data along different dimensions, and we find that intentional orchestrators are roughly 5 times as likely as non-orchestrators to report their leaders understand how to distribute work among internal and external workers. So that's just one example of something that if you have a large number of external contributors, you should think about how to distribute the work. And intentional orchestrators are 5 times more likely, at least to report that, yes, they know how to do that. So our research shows that companies that are most intentionally orchestrating have 5 common characteristics. And they're far more likely than other organizations to do these 5 things. I will walk through them very quickly, again, given our time constraints. So the first is that they closely coordinate cross-functional management of both internal and external workers, right? Most obviously, if they're good at this and they recognize that they have this type of an organization, then they need to get better at being able to coordinate. And the notion of coordination is a topic that comes up a number of times. They know how to hire and engage both internal and external talent that they need. They support managers who are seeking to hire external workers, because hiring external workers is not the same as hiring internal workers, and providing a tool set and a system to be able to do that well, repeatedly, in a managed way is, again, non-trivial. They have leadership that understands how to allocate work for both internal and external contributors. That was what I was talking about earlier. And they align their workforce approach with their business strategy. So as a strategy professor, this topic is very interesting to me. And you'll see in our work that we talk about the best companies who are farthest ahead thinking about this. Traditionally, companies say, okay, here's our business strategy. Now, what workforce do we need to accomplish that? What's our human capital to support our strategy? The best companies these days that we see are starting to say, hey, we have this workforce ecosystem. Excuse me. We have access to all of these external contributors. Some have interesting skills that we don't have inside. Had an interesting conversation that someone just wrote about a creative agency harnessing TikTok skills of people who were outside, who they could contract with, and all of a sudden they realized they were able to offer TikTok skills to their clients that they wouldn't have been able to offer just with their much more mature internal workforce, right? So this notion that you can change your business strategy based on who you have access to externally and who you can then, through the combination, leverage is, I think, a really interesting way to think about this. All right, so another framework so we have this maturity index that we've looked at, and from that led us to think more about what's a good framework to help us understand orchestrating workforce ecosystems. And so this hexagon appears in a lot of our work, and you're going to see it more and more. And essentially what we've said is there are themes that are coming through, which are management practices are changing, as I showed you with the little circles. Technology enablers, I've mentioned some examples of those. Integration architectures means how tightly or loosely are you managing this set of external contributors and also within your organization? And leadership approaches, what needs to change? For example, leading in an environment where you have much less direct control because you're spanning organizational boundaries. And then outside of the hexagon, we have the various examples of the various parties, they're not all the parties, who have major roles in these discussions. And essentially it's 3 axes. So through the middle, you have the senior leaders, business unit leaders. Along the top, you have human resources and procurement, who are key players in most organizations that we talked with. And then IT, finance, and legal are essential to get this working. And the way we've structured our book, for example, is there are 4 or 5 chapters that address each of these hexagons. So there's a chapter on management practices, there's one on technology enablers, et cetera, and I will tell you more about that. All right, so then relatively recently, last month, February 2023, we came up with an infographic because the research is, again, as I said, we're trying to span how do we make this most relevant to leaders. So if you go on, again, our website, you'll see we have this infographic, and I will See, we're at 9:40 already, so I'm going to flip through it quickly to just give you a sense. This takes this maturity index, thinking about how intentional orchestrators operate, and then breaks it down. So this previous one is, again, the definition. You've all seen that already. We talk about definitions. Again, people get very hung up on these definitions. Here we introduce the workforce index. And as I said, we had 12% as intentional orchestrators, 14% as non-orchestrators, 74% in the middle. These are 8 ways that intentional orchestrators outperform. I had mentioned 5 before. We've done a little more research. Here are 8 that you can look at. I'll give you some examples. For example, as I said, this allocating work, 89% of intentional orchestrators feel their organizations take the right approach, whereas non-orchestrators, it's only 15%. We think these are stark differences, and that's what leads us to believe that there truly is a difference in how organizations address this. Accessing workers, 80% of intentional orchestrators are able to hire the employees they need. 91% will engage external contributors over the next 18 to 24 months. Culture is a huge question. I was on a call yesterday with many CHROs and some of their staffs, and we kept diving into questions of culture. 91% believe that you should integrate, or that they integrate external contributors into their culture when they're intentional orchestrators. I'm hesitating because we have some interesting stories of companies who have said, we don't really want to integrate them because some of our contingent workforce doesn't want to be integrated. They'd rather be transactional. That's why they're contingent workers. And so to me, this is a very interesting area for potential research and conversation. This is managing across functional areas. Again, you can see there's a big difference. And again, managing for performance, there's a big difference between intentional and non. We also talk here about labor laws, ethics, and social responsibilities. The third part of our book is about social responsibility, labor laws, ethics. One of my co-authors, David, has a PhD in ethics, and this continues to come up, right? Worker rights, worker responsibilities, social safety net, fairness, benefits, labor laws. They're huge topics, and we don't want to minimize them at all. So there's a big section in the book. I'm not going to talk too much about them here, but it's a big part of this discussion. Okay, so there's the picture of the book. And again, here's the real version of the book. If you're interested in this topic, we worked pretty hard to have it. We negotiated with MIT Press that the list price was $29 US. And if you buy them on Amazon, I think they're discounted and you can find them for less. So this is part of a series called Management on the Cutting Edge. Here's we broke it down again. Introduction, part 1 is introducing workforce ecosystems, 2 is orchestrating, and 3 is social responsibility. These are the chapters. Given our timing, I think I am not going to spend much time, but essentially they follow what I've just walked you through, right? And so the first 3 are, what are these things? And it goes pretty deeply, well, in chapter 3, a little more into the strategy discussion that I just mentioned, of kind of flipping the switch of how you think about it. Then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 are all about orchestrating, right? That's essentially blowing out the hexagon and talking about it. I will tell you, I think it's okay for me to tell you, we are going to do another infographic that will be more about these hexagons. And this weekend, I will be drafting a short article specifically about the hexagons. So that framework is how we're going to continue to discuss these topics for the foreseeable future. And then part 3, again, ethics, social responsibility, and perspectives on the future. There's our Amazon site. Please pre-order because it seems to matter for some reason to rankings and things. I'll leave that up for a moment. That's a QR code that will get you right to the webpage. Oh, actually, you'll see I built this slide while I was sitting in the UK. So so that will get you to the MIT Press site. This slide shows you can get it from amazon.co.uk. Blackwell's, Foyles, those are the UK, some of the UK outlets. And interestingly enough, I guess, depending on where you're coming from when you get to the MIT Press page, you will get the appropriate boxes, depending, I guess, on the country. And so that's what I have in terms of preparation for you. Thank you so much for your time. And I would love to take questions.